August 1823. The northern plains of what is now South Dakota. There is a man lying face down in the dirt. He can barely breathe. His throat has been torn open. His back looks like something dragged a rake through it, deep enough to see bone. His scalp has been peeled back. One of his legs is broken in 2 places. He has no rifle, no knife, no food, no water. The 2 men who were supposed to stay with him until he died, well, they decided they'd rather live, so they took his gear and left him in a shallow grave. The nearest outpost of civilization is somewhere around 200 miles away. And Hugh Glass, fur trapper, mountain man, survivor of things that would make your nightmares blush, decided he wasn't done yet. You've probably heard of the Revenant. You've seen Leonardo DiCaprio rolling through snow and surviving things that would kill most men twice over, and that movie is remarkable. But I'm going to tell you something right now. The real story is worse and more incredible, and it ends in a way that the movie doesn't have the guts to show you, because the truth is stranger and more human than any screenplay. Stay with me. Part 1. Who was Hugh Glass? To understand why Hugh Glass survived what he survived, you have to understand who Hugh Glass was before the bear ever found him. And that is where this story gets strange immediately. Almost nothing about Hugh Glass's early life is certain. He left no written records. He was not the kind of man who kept a journal. What we know comes from a handful of accounts, some published while he was still alive, some pieced together decades after his death by people who knew men who knew him. The gaps in the record are enormous, and yet what fills those gaps is almost too wild to believe. Here's what historians broadly agree on. Hugh Glass was born somewhere around 1783, probably in Pennsylvania, probably to Irish immigrant parents. He went to sea as a young man, as a sailor, doing the brutal work of 19th century ocean freight. Somewhere around 1816, the ship he was working on was taken by the pirate Jean Lafitte in the Gulf of Mexico. Jean Lafitte, the same pirate who would later help Andrew Jackson defend New Orleans. A man so feared, so capable, so utterly lawless that the U.S. government essentially had to negotiate with him because they couldn't stop him. Glass was captured, made to serve. And according to the accounts that survive, he did serve for nearly 2 years before he escaped by swimming to shore near what is now Galveston, Texas, and disappearing into the wilderness. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, alone on the Texas coast with nothing. What he did next is something most people don't know, and I think it matters enormously for understanding the rest of the story. He walked north and west into the territory of the Pawnee. Now, this is not the movie. In the movie, Glass has a Pawnee wife and a son, and that invented family becomes his whole motivation. That is Hollywood filling an emotional hole. It didn't happen, but what did happen is still remarkable. Glass was taken in by the Pawnee, and not as a prisoner. He was adopted into the tribe. He learned their language. He learned their methods of hunting, their ways of moving through the land, their survival skills, how to read terrain, how to find water, how to stay warm, how to track and be tracked. He lived with them for years. Think about that. Before Hugh Glass was a mountain man, he was a pirate's captive and an adopted Pawnee. He was already a man who had survived things other men hadn't. He had already been tested by the world and come back different. In 1821, Glass traveled to St. Louis with a delegation of Pawnee leaders who had been invited to meet with U.S. authorities, and there his next life began. In 1822, a man named William Henry Ashley placed an advertisement in the Missouri Gazette. He was looking for 100 men. His exact words were, "Men to ascend the River Missouri as part of a fur trading expedition. The pay was good. The danger was real." And roughly 100 men showed up, including Hugh Glass. They called themselves the Ashley Henry Party. They were trappers, hunters, adventurers, and a handful of young men who had no business being out there but wanted to see the country. They would become some of the most famous mountain men in American history. Jim Bridger was there, just 19 years old. Jedediah Smith was there. And Hugh Glass, now pushing 40, already a man with more lives behind him than most people see in a lifetime. The expedition set off up the Missouri River. Within a few months, they had been attacked by the Arikara tribe, lost more than a dozen men, and been forced to restructure their entire route. Glass was wounded in that first attack, lightly, but it was a preview of the country they were moving through. This was not adventure tourism. People died out here, often and badly. By late August of 1823, the group had made it to the valley of the Grand River in what is now South Dakota. Captain Andrew Henry was leading this portion of the party. They were moving overland toward the Yellowstone River, trying to stay ahead of the Arikara, who wanted their blood. And it was here, in the brush along the Grand River, that Hugh Glass made one of the most ordinary and catastrophic mistakes a man on the frontier could make. He wandered off alone. Glass had gone ahead of the group, as he sometimes did, scouting or hunting. He was moving through thick brush along the river bottom, the kind of terrain where visibility drops to a few feet in any direction. And he walked directly into a grizzly bear sow with 2 cubs. If you know anything about grizzly bears, you know that there is nothing more dangerous on the North American continent than a grizzly mother who believes her cubs are threatened. A grizzly bear in that state is not a predator in the conventional sense. She is not hunting you. She is not afraid of you. She is simply going to destroy you as efficiently as possible because you are between her and her young. Glass managed to get off one shot. It hit the bear. It did not stop her. What happened next is recorded in enough separate accounts that the broad outline is not in dispute, even if the details vary. The bear mauled him severely. She raked her claws across his back deeply enough to expose his ribs. She tore into his scalp and shredded it. She bit into his throat. She broke his leg. She shook him like a dog shakes a rat. His companions, hearing the shot and then the screaming, came running. They killed the bear, but the damage had already been done. One of the men who was there later described finding Glass as being tore all to pieces. That's a quote. That is how a man who watched it happen described it. Tore all to pieces. They carried him with them for 2 days on a litter of cut branches, convinced he was going to die at any moment. He was breathing, barely, through a throat that had been torn open, but he was unconscious, feverish, and showing no signs of recovery. Every morning they expected to find him gone. Captain Henry had a problem. They were moving through hostile territory. Arikara raiding parties were in the area. Every hour they stopped, every slow mile they traveled with a dying man on a stretcher was another hour of exposure, another mile of vulnerability. Men were going to die if they kept this pace, but you couldn't just leave a man to die alone. That violated something fundamental about the code of the frontier, the idea that you didn't abandon your own. So Henry made a compromise that, in retrospect, was no compromise at all. He asked for volunteers. 2 men to stay behind with Glass, to sit with him until he died, which everyone agreed would be hours, maybe a day, and then bury him properly and catch up with the group. 2 men volunteered. One was John Fitzgerald, an experienced trapper in his 30s. The other was Jim Bridger, 19 years old, barely a man, probably terrified. Henry and the rest of the party moved on, and then days passed. Glass didn't die. He kept breathing, barely, unconsciously, but breathing. And Fitzgerald, who had signed up to wait a few hours, maybe a day, was now sitting in hostile territory with a man who refused to die, watching the rest of his companions get further away with each passing day, listening for the sounds of Arikara. We don't know exactly what Fitzgerald said to Bridger. We don't know the conversation they had. What we know is what they did. They took Glass's rifle. They took his knife. They took his steel and flint. They dug a shallow grave. And whether they put him in it while he was still alive or simply left him next to it, they left him there, abandoned, unarmed, alone. And they went to catch up with Henry's party, telling them Glass had died. Hugh Glass woke up in a hole in the ground with nothing. I want you to sit with this for a moment. It is August 1823. You are lying in the dirt of what is now South Dakota. You have a broken leg. Your back has been shredded open. Your throat has been punctured. You have no weapon, no food, no fire-starting equipment, no way to signal anyone. The nearest friendly outpost, Fort Kiowa, is somewhere between 200 and 250 miles to the southeast. You are alone in a way that almost no person alive today can genuinely imagine. There is no one coming. There is no rescue. There is nothing between you and the horizon except grass, wolves, Arikara war parties, and empty sky. What does a person do in that moment? Hugh Glass crawled. He couldn't walk. His leg was broken. So he set the leg himself. This is documented in multiple accounts, and he began to move. Not run, not walk, crawl, pulling himself across the ground with his arms, dragging his broken leg behind him, inching southeast toward the Missouri River. In the first days, he ate whatever he could reach without standing. Berries, roots, insects. He drank from streams by lying flat and putting his face in the water. His wounds were infected. Maggots had gotten into the deeper lacerations on his back. And here is a detail that I find almost impossible to process even now, knowing how it ends. Glass let them stay, because he understood, on some level, that the maggots were eating the dead and rotting flesh, cleaning the wounds, preventing the kind of systemic infection that would have killed him. This was not civilization medicine. There were no doctors out there, no hospitals, no antiseptic. This was a man using the only tools available to him, including the insects eating him alive, to survive. He crawled for days. Then, slowly, he was able to stand. Then limp, then walk painfully with a makeshift staff cut from a branch. About a week into his journey, he came across a pack of wolves who had just brought down a buffalo calf. He waited until they had fed and moved off, then went to the carcass and ate the raw meat. Survival requires setting aside everything you think you know about acceptable behavior. Some accounts say that friendly Lakota Sioux encountered Glass along the way, gave him food, and helped dress his wounds before sending him on. This is plausible. Relations between trappers and the Lakota were complex, sometimes hostile, often neutral, occasionally generous. Whether it happened or not, Glass made it to the banks of the Cheyenne River, built himself a crude raft, and floated downstream toward the Missouri. He arrived at Fort Kiowa in October 1823. He had been mauled and left for dead in late August. He had crawled and limped and floated somewhere between 200 and 250 miles across one of the most inhospitable stretches of wilderness on the continent. It had taken him roughly 6 weeks. 6 weeks. When he staggered into Fort Kiowa, the people there almost certainly didn't believe what they were seeing. This was a man who had been declared dead. Men from Henry's party had come through Fort Kiowa and reported that Hugh Glass was gone. And yet here he was, ragged, scarred, barely able to stand, smelling like a wound. And a river, but alive. What did he want? He wanted his rifle back. And he wanted to find John Fitzgerald. What happens next in the movie is revenge. A blood vendetta. Fire and violence and a son to avenge. What happened next in reality is something quieter, stranger, and I think ultimately more powerful. Glass recovered at Fort Kiowa for several weeks. Then he joined another expedition heading north to find Henry and his men at the Yellowstone. On that journey, he was attacked again, this time by Arikara, and had to survive another stretch of wilderness alone, though shorter. He made it. Again. When he finally caught up with Henry's party, he found Jim Bridger. Bridger was 19 years old. just barely a man. He had done a terrible thing, abandoned a dying man, taken his gear, lied about his death. But he was also a teenager who had been terrified and talked into it by an older, more experienced man. Glass looked at him, and he let him go. He told Bridger that he forgave him, that he was young, that he had been led astray. The accounts that survive suggest Glass was genuinely moved by Bridger's obvious guilt and fear. And so he chose, deliberately, consciously, not to destroy him. Jim Bridger went on to become one of the most celebrated mountain men and scouts in American history. Fort Bridger in Wyoming is named after him. He guided thousands of emigrants along the Oregon and Mormon trails. He was a legend in his own lifetime. And some historians have quietly noted that Hugh Glass's choice to forgive rather than kill was part of what made that legacy possible. Fitzgerald was a different matter. Glass tracked him down next. But by the time Glass found him, Fitzgerald had done something Glass hadn't anticipated. He had joined the United States Army, and this is where the Frontier Code ran directly into American law. To kill an enlisted soldier of the U.S. Army was not frontier justice, it was murder, and it would mean execution. Glass had survived too much, come too far, burned too long on the fire of this mission to throw his life away on a technicality. So he made Fitzgerald give him the rifle back. And he walked away. I've thought about that moment a lot. A man who crawled 200 miles on a broken leg, who ate insects and raw buffalo and let maggots clean his wounds, who crossed one of the emptiest and most dangerous stretches of land on the continent, twice, and whose entire stated motivation was revenge and the recovery of his gun. Got the gun. Chose not to kill the man. The movie can't use that ending. It's too complicated. It doesn't satisfy the emotional hunger that 3 hours of suffering builds up in an audience. We want the reckoning. We want the blood. But the real story says something the movie is not willing to say. Surviving doesn't make you a killer. It makes you someone who knows exactly how much a life costs. Hugh Glass lived for another decade after the bear. He kept trapping, kept moving, kept surviving things that should have killed him. In the winter of 1833, he was attacked on the frozen Yellowstone River by a band of Arikara warriors. He was killed, along with 2 companions, at roughly 50 years old. He left no memoir, no family records. No children that history has confirmed. What he left was a story, told and retold around campfires and in trading posts across the West, eventually making it into journals and newspapers, and 2 centuries later into one of the most visually stunning films ever made. But here is what I want you to take from the real story. Hugh Glass was not superhuman. He was a man who had spent decades being made harder by the world, by the sea, by captivity, by the Pawnee, by the frontier itself, until he had a resilience that most people will never have to call on. When the worst possible thing happened to him, he didn't have a plan. He didn't have a weapon or a phone or a rescue service. He had the lessons his life had already taught him. And that, in the end, was enough. The frontier didn't reward the strongest or the most educated or the best equipped. It rewarded the ones who refused to stop. That's Hugh Glass. That's Frontier Legacy Tales. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what you're actually capable of, tell me in the comments. I want to know what part of this landed for you. And if you're new here, subscribe. Because we are just getting started, and every story we tell is going to be this real. I'll see you tomorrow.